The river's rage echoed through the canyon as Penelope Jameson clung to the rock outcropping, her sodden skirts weighing her down like an anchor in the churning waters. The wagon train had crossed without her, leaving nothing behind but fading hoofprints and the hollow promise that they'd send help once they reached safer ground. April 1875 had brought unprecedented rains to the Texas Panhandle, transforming the typically manageable Canadian river into a roaring monster that had claimed 2 wagons already. The decision to press forward had been made by the wagon master himself, but in the chaos of the crossing, no one had noticed when Penelope's horse had been spooked by a water snake, throwing her into the shallows near the banks. "Help!" She called out again, her voice raw from shouting, though she knew it was futile. The wagon train was long gone, seeking higher ground before the storm worsened. Night was falling, and with it, the temperature. Her fingers were already numb from gripping the jagged stone that kept her from being swept downstream. The sound of hooves pounding against the muddy earth cut through the roar of the river. Penelope strained her neck, looking back toward the trail they'd come from. A lone rider approached, his silhouette backlit by the fading sunset. His horse, a powerful chestnut stallion, seemed to glide across the treacherous ground with practiced ease. "Hold on," a deep voice called out. As he drew closer, Penelope could make out his features, a strong jawline shadowed by several days' growth of beard, and eyes the color of the stormy sky above. He wore a worn leather duster and a hat pulled low against the spitting rain. The cowboy dismounted with fluid grace, tethering his horse to a nearby tree. "Miss Jameson," he called, recognition flickering across his face. It took her a moment to place him Colton Daniels, one of the outriders who had joined their wagon train in Independence. He kept mostly to himself, riding ahead to scout or behind to ensure no one fell back. She'd exchanged perhaps a dozen words with him in the month since they'd departed. "Mr. Daniels," she gasped, relieved to see a familiar face. They left. I know." His voice was grim as he assessed the situation. "The wagon master sent me back, said he couldn't risk more lives but couldn't leave you either." He didn't add what they both knew, that most of the men had been too concerned with their own families and possessions to volunteer for the dangerous task. Colton studied the raging water, then began removing his boots. "I'm coming to get you, don't let go." "The current's too strong," she protested, "not stronger than I am." There was no boast in his tone, just simple determination. He shrugged off his duster and gun belt, leaving them on the bank. Penelope watched as he waded into the shallows, wincing as the cold water hit him. The river, swollen with rainwater, pulled at his legs, but he moved with deliberate steps, testing each foothold before committing his weight. "Tell me about Virginia," he called to her, his voice raised over the rush of water. "That's where you're from, right?" She realized he was trying to keep her mind occupied. "Yes, Richmond," she answered, grateful for the distraction from her precarious position. "My father was a doctor there before the war, and now you're headed to Amarillo." He was closer now, perhaps 15 feet away. "Got family there, my uncle. He has a small ranch outside town." Her teeth chattered, not just from cold but from fear. "He wrote that they need teachers." Colton nodded, focusing on his footing as he navigated a particularly treacherous stretch. "A misstep here would send them both downstream. You'll make a fine teacher." The compliment, unexpected and sincere, warmed her despite the cold. She'd noticed him watching her sometimes when she'd gathered the children from the wagon train to continue their lessons during rest stops. She'd assumed he was merely curious about the impromptu school, but perhaps he had been watching her. He was just a few feet away now, close enough that she could see the water dripping from his dark hair. "I'm going to need you to trust me," he said, extending his hand. "Can you do that, Miss Jameson?" Penelope nodded, though fear made her hesitate. The rock had been her only security in the chaos, and releasing it meant putting her life entirely in this man's hands, a man she barely knew. "I won't let you go," he promised, reading her thoughts. "Not now, not ever." Something in the intensity of his gaze made her believe him. She reached out, her cold fingers finding his warm, calloused palm. With surprising gentleness, he pulled her from her perch and into his arms. "Hold on to me," he instructed, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, pressed against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, a counterpoint to her own racing pulse. The return journey to the shore was agonizingly slow. Colton moved with painstaking care, one arm securing Penelope to him, the other occasionally reaching out to stabilize them against rocks or debris in the water. Twice his foot slipped, and Penelope gasped as they momentarily dipped deeper into the frigid current, but each time he recovered, his powerful frame sheltering her from the worst of the river's fury. When they finally reached the bank, Colton didn't immediately release her. Instead, he carried her several yards inland before gently setting her down on a relatively dry patch of ground beneath a stand of cottonwoods. "Thank you," Penelope managed through chattering teeth. Her dress clung to her, soaked and heavy. "We're not safe yet." Colton retrieved his duster and wrapped it around her shoulders. "That storm's getting worse and we need to find shelter." He glanced at the darkening sky. "There's an abandoned line shack about 2 miles back. Not much, but it's got 4 walls and a roof." "What about the wagon train?" Penelope asked, though she already knew the answer. "They won't stop until they reach higher ground. We'll catch up once the river subsides." He helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, creating a protective embrace that she found herself leaning into despite her proper upbringing. The ride to the line shack was conducted in silence, save for the rumble of thunder and the steady beat of rain. Penelope was acutely aware of Colton's presence, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the gentle way he steadied her when the horse negotiated particularly rough terrain. The line shack proved to be little more than a one-room structure with a sagging roof and walls that had weathered years of neglect. Still, it was dry inside, and Colton quickly set about building a fire in the small stone fireplace. "You should change out of those wet clothes," he said, keeping his back to her as he coaxed the flames higher. "I've got a spare shirt in my saddlebag. It's not much, but it's dry." Penelope hesitated, propriety warring with practicality. Her mother would be scandalized at the thought of her changing in the presence of a man, let alone wearing his clothing. But her mother wasn't here, and pneumonia was a real threat. "Thank you," she said, accepting the offered shirt. Colton respectfully turned his attention to unpacking his meager supplies while she ducked behind a tattered blanket he had hung for her privacy. The shirt was clean but worn soft with age, smelling faintly of leather and open plains. It hung nearly to her knees, and she used one of her hairpins to secure it closed at the neck. Her wet dress and underthings she hung near the fire, hoping they would dry by morning. When she emerged from behind the makeshift screen, Colton had laid out a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. He had removed his own wet shirt, replacing it with a woolen blanket draped over his shoulders. The firelight played across the planes of his face, highlighting cheekbones that could have been carved from stone. "It's not much of a supper," he apologized, gesturing to the food. "It's more than I expected to have," she replied honestly. "I thought." She couldn't finish the sentence, the reality of how close she had come to death suddenly overwhelming. "Don't think about that," Colton said quietly. "You're here now, safe." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and the drumming of rain on the roof creating a strangely intimate atmosphere. "How did you know?" Penelope finally asked. "That I was missing, I mean." Colton's expression grew thoughtful. "I always do a final count before a crossing, force of habit from my time in the army. I noticed you weren't with the others when they reached the far bank." The wagon master said everyone was accounted for. A shadow crossed Colton's face. "Holly's isn't the most thorough man I've encountered." He was in a hurry to get the wagons moving again. "So you came back on your own." The idea that he had risked his life for her, potentially against orders, made something flutter in her chest. "I couldn't leave you behind." The simplicity of his statement held a wealth of emotion that Penelope couldn't fully decipher. "Get some rest, Miss Jameson. Tomorrow will be a long day." Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Penelope. She lay on the thin bedroll Colton had insisted she take, while he made do with his saddle and blanket near the door. The storm raged outside, occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the shack's interior. In those brief moments of illumination, she studied her rescuer. Colton Daniels was not a handsome man in the conventional sense. His features were too weathered, his expression too guarded. But there was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that made her feel secure despite their precarious situation. She had learned little about him during their journey. He kept to himself, rarely joining in the evening gatherings around the campfire. Some of the women in the wagon train speculated that he was running from the law, while others suggested a broken heart. Penelope had paid little attention to the gossip, focused as she was on her own journey and the uncertain future awaiting her in Amarillo. Now, stranded with him in this isolated shack, she found herself curious about the man who had risked everything to save her, Mr. Daniels. She called softly, unsure if he was awake. "Yes, Miss Jameson?" His response was immediate, suggesting he had been as restless as she. "I realized I never properly thanked you for coming back for me." She heard him shift, and then his voice came again, closer this time. "No thanks necessary. I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd left you there. Still, most men would have continued with the wagon train. It was the safer choice." There was a long pause before he replied. "I've never been one to take the safe path, not when the right one lies elsewhere." Something in his tone made her heart quicken. "Where are you from, Mr. Daniels? Originally, I mean." Another pause, longer this time. "Colorado Territory. My father had a small cattle operation there. It's gone now, raiders during the war, my father with it." "I'm sorry," she offered, understanding loss all too well. The war had claimed her own brother, and the aftermath had taken her mother through grief and illness. "It was a long time ago," he said, though his voice suggested the wound was far from healed. "What about you?" "What brings a Virginia lady to the Texas Panhandle?" Penelope sighed, the familiar ache of her own losses rising within her. "After my mother passed last year, there wasn't much left for me in Richmond. My father's practice never recovered after the war and our home." She trailed off, remembering the indignity of watching strangers pick through their belongings at the estate auction. "My uncle wrote that Amarillo is growing. They need a school teacher and I need a fresh start. Brave of you, making such a journey alone." She laughed softly, without humor. "Not brave, desperate perhaps, or merely practical. A 23-year-old spinster has limited options in Richmond society." "Spinster?" The surprise in his voice was evident. "Surely that's not how you see yourself." "It's how others saw me," she admitted. "Too bookish, too opinionated, too independent for most suitors' tastes." "Their loss," Colton said simply, and Penelope was glad for the darkness that hid her blush. The conversation lapsed into silence, but it was a comfortable one, filled with the unspoken understanding of two people who had glimpsed something of each other's souls. Eventually, Penelope drifted into sleep, lulled by the rhythm of the rain and the security of Colton's presence. Her dreams were a jumble of rushing water and strong arms carrying her to safety. She awoke to the gentle touch of sunlight on her face. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world that sparkled with morning dew. Colton was already up, tending to his horse outside the shack. Penelope quickly changed back into her now dry dress, pinning her hair as best she could without a mirror. When she stepped outside, Colton turned to her, his expression softening briefly before returning to its usual guardedness. "The river's still high," he reported, "but I've found a safer crossing point about half a mile downstream. There's a series of boulders we can use." "Will we catch up to the wagon train?" Penelope asked, already dreading the answer. Colton's hesitation confirmed her fears. "Not likely. They'll have made good time once they reached higher ground, but I know the route to Amarillo. I can get you there safely." The implication hung in the air between them. They would be traveling alone, just the two of them, for days. In the clear light of day, the intimacy of their situation was impossible to ignore. That would be improper, Penelope said, though the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. Colton's expression remained impassive. What would be improper would be abandoning you here. I made a promise to see you safely to Amarillo, and I intend to keep it. She knew he was right. Without him, she had no hope of reaching her destination. She had no experience with the dangers of the trail, no weapon, and precious little in the way of supplies. Her only option was to trust him. Very well, Mr. Daniels, she conceded, but I insist on riding my own horse once we recover it. Her mount had bolted during the incident but was likely to have found shelter somewhere nearby. A ghost of a smile touched Colton's lips. Already spotted her grazing about a quarter-mile back. And please call me Colton. If we're to be traveling companions, we might as well dispense with formalities. The familiar address should have scandalized her, but instead, Penelope found it comforting. Then you must call me Penelope. The journey to recover her horse and cross the river was arduous but uneventful. True to his word, Colton had found a safer crossing a natural ford where large boulders broke the current's force. He led the way, testing each step, occasionally extending a hand to help Penelope navigate particularly treacherous spots. By midday, they had reached the far bank and picked up the wagon train's trail. The rutted tracks of multiple wagons were clear in the mud, heading northwest toward the plains that would eventually lead them to Amarillo. We'll make camp early, Colton decided as the afternoon waned. Give the horses a chance to recover from the crossing. He selected a campsite with the eye of a man accustomed to life on the trail, a small clearing protected from the wind by a stand of trees, with a clear view of the surrounding terrain. Penelope watched him move about the camp with efficient grace, gathering firewood, checking the horses, preparing a simple meal. As dusk fell, they sat beside the small fire, the prairie stretching endlessly around them. Stars began to appear overhead, more brilliant than Penelope had ever seen them back east. It's beautiful, she breathed, gazing up at the vast expanse of sky. It is, Colton agreed, though when she glanced at him, she found him looking not at the stars but at her. He quickly averted his gaze, but the moment lingered between them, charged with unspoken possibility. Tell me about Amarillo, he said after a while. What do you know of it? Penelope leaned back, warming her hands by the fire. Not much. My uncle writes that it's growing rapidly since the buffalo hunters arrived. He runs a small cattle operation just outside town and also serves as a scout for the army occasionally. Your uncle's name, Peter Jameson. Do you know him? Colton shook his head. The name's not familiar, but the Panhandle's a big place. What about your teaching position? Is it arranged? Uncle Peter mentioned the town is establishing a proper school. Until now, children have been taught by the preacher's wife, but she's expecting a child of her own and can no longer manage. And you've always wanted to be a teacher. There was genuine curiosity in his voice. Penelope smiled, memories of her childhood dreams surfacing. Actually, I once hoped to become a doctor like my father. I used to help in his practice, learning about medicines and treatments, but that was before. Before the war, Colton finished for her. It changed everything for all of us. She nodded, grateful for his understanding. What about you? Have you always been a? She hesitated, unsure how to define him. Drifter? He supplied with a wry smile. No, after my father's ranch was destroyed, I joined the Union Army, cavalry. After the war, I tried settling down, but he shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its simplicity. Some men aren't meant for roots. And now you guide wagon trains, when the work's available. Otherwise, I take odd jobs, ranch hand, scout, whatever pays for ammunition and coffee. The casual reference to such a precarious existence made Penelope's heart ache. Despite his competence and strength, there was something solitary about Colton that spoke of old wounds never properly healed. What will you do after you deliver me to Amarillo? She asked, surprised by how much the answer mattered to her. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night. "Haven't decided. There's talk of work down San Antonio way, or I might head north for a spell." The thought of him simply riding away once his self-imposed duty was complete left an unexpected hollowness in Penelope's chest. It was ridiculous, of course. They had known each other for barely more than a day, yet already she felt connected to him in ways she couldn't articulate. "Well, I'm grateful our paths crossed when they did," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "Providence, I suppose." Colton's gaze met hers across the fire, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "Providence," he echoed softly, as if testing the idea. "Perhaps." The days that followed fell into a rhythm of travel and companionship that Penelope found surprisingly comfortable. They rode from dawn until late afternoon, making steady progress across the changing landscape. Colton proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to read the signs of water nearby, identify edible plants, and make camp efficiently. Their conversations grew easier, ranging from books they had read to places they had seen. Penelope discovered that beneath Colton's taciturn exterior lay a mind that was both thoughtful and well-informed. He had educated himself through reading whenever books were available, and his experiences had given him insights that sometimes startled her with their perception. In turn, she shared stories of her life in Richmond, her father's medical practice, her mother's passion for music, the garden she had tended through even the worst days of the war. She found herself telling him things she had never shared with anyone about her fears and hopes, the dreams she had reluctantly set aside, the loneliness that had driven her west. On the fourth day of their journey, they encountered the first sign of trouble. Colton reined in suddenly, his posture alert as he studied the horizon. "What is it?" Penelope asked, following his gaze but seeing nothing amiss in the rolling grassland. "Smoke," he said tersely. "Too much for a campfire, could be a prairie fire, but—" He frowned, calculating distances and wind direction. "It's near the wagon train's route." Without further discussion, he urged his horse forward, Penelope following close behind. As they crested a small rise, the source of the smoke became clear. In the valley below, 3 wagons were arranged in a defensive circle. 2 were ablaze, sending plumes of black smoke into the clear blue sky. Figures moved around the remaining wagon, some on horseback, others on foot. "Raiders," Colton muttered, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. "Stay here." "Is it the wagon train?" Penelope asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Colton shook his head. "Too few wagons, probably a family group traveling separately." He handed her his spyglass. "Count how many raiders there are while I circle around. If anything happens to me, ride east. You'll hit the Canadian River again. Follow it downstream until you reach Fort Elliott." Before she could protest, he was gone, guiding his horse down the back slope of the hill where they wouldn't be silhouetted against the sky. Penelope raised the spyglass with trembling hands. The scene below swam into focus, 5 men on horseback circling the lone wagon, firing occasionally at defenders she couldn't see. As she watched, one of the raiders fell from his horse, hit by return fire from the wagon. The air seemed to freeze in her lungs as she recognized one of the riders, Holly's, the wagon master who had declared her accounted for and left her at the river crossing. He was not a victim here, but one of the attackers, his distinctive red beard unmistakable even at this distance. The realization struck her like a physical blow. If Colton hadn't come back for her, if she had managed to rejoin the wagon train, she might have met the same fate as the family below. A rifle shot cracked the air, and another raider tumbled from his saddle. Colton had found his position and was picking off the attackers from the cover of a small gully. The remaining 3, including Holly's, wheeled their horses around, trying to locate the new threat. One spotted Colton and shouted a warning, sending a wild shot in his direction. Holly's immediately turned his horse and fled, abandoning his companions without hesitation. The other two hesitated only briefly before following suit, firing a few parting shots as they retreated. Penelope waited until the raiders had disappeared over the horizon before guiding her horse down to join Colton, who was already approaching the remaining wagon. "Hello, the wagon," he called, keeping his rifle ready but pointed at the ground. "We mean no harm." A woman's face appeared cautiously above the wagon bed, a shotgun in her hands. "Who are you?" "Name's Colton Daniels. This is Miss Penelope Jameson. We saw the smoke and came to help." After a moment's hesitation, the woman lowered her weapon. "Sarah Miller," she introduced herself. "My husband Jacob is wounded and our son." Her voice broke. "Our Benjamin didn't make it." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Jacob Miller had taken a bullet in the shoulder, and while the wound wasn't immediately life-threatening, it required attention. Penelope's experience assisting her father proved invaluable as she cleaned and bandaged the injury. Using the medical supplies from her own trunk and herbs she had gathered along their journey. Young Benjamin Miller, barely 16, had been killed in the initial attack. His parents had been traveling to join relatives in Tascosa when the raiders had ambushed them, claiming to be toll collectors for safe passage through the territory. "It was a shakedown," Jacob explained weakly as Penelope changed his bandages the following morning. "When I refused to pay, they started shooting. Took our horses, our money, most of our supplies. One of them was familiar to me," Penelope said carefully. "The wagon master from the train I was traveling with Hollies." Sarah's face hardened. "He was the leader, called himself Captain Hollies. Said this was his territory now." Colton, who had been securing the perimeter of their camp, returned in time to hear this. "Hollies was never a captain of anything except his own greed. He's been running this scheme for months, signing on as wagon master, identifying wealthy or vulnerable travelers, then circling back with his gang after he's gained their trust." "You knew about this?" Penelope couldn't keep the accusation from her voice. "I suspected," Colton admitted. "There have been too many Indian attacks reported along this route recently, but the pattern didn't fit any tribe's usual behavior. That's why I signed on with your wagon train in the first place, to investigate." The revelation that Colton was more than a simple guide shifted Penelope's understanding of him yet again. "Are you a lawman?" A shadow crossed his face. "Not officially. Let's just say I have a personal interest in seeing men like Hollies brought to justice." Before Penelope could press for more details, Sarah interrupted. "What do we do now? We can't move Jacob and we have no horses for the wagon." Colton considered the problem. "We're about 3 days from Amarillo with horses, longer without. But there's a small settlement about a day's ride east Parker's Creek. They might be able to help." "I can't leave Jacob," Sarah insisted. "And we can't leave you both here unprotected," Penelope added. After some discussion, they agreed on a plan. Colton would ride to Parker's Creek for help, while Penelope would remain with the Millers. He would leave them his rifle and additional ammunition, taking only his pistol for protection. "I don't like leaving you," he told Penelope privately as he prepared to depart. "Hollies and his men could return." "We'll be vigilant," she assured him, though her own fear was a cold knot in her stomach. "And you'll be back soon." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a polished stone pendant on a leather cord. "This was my mother's," he said, placing it in her palm. "It's supposed to bring protection to its wearer. I'd feel better if you had it." The simple gift moved her deeply. She slipped the cord over her head, feeling the weight of the smooth stone against her skin. "Thank you. I'll keep it safe until you return." "Keep yourself safe," he corrected, his eyes intense. "The pendant is just a thing, you are." He trailed off, seemingly unable to find the words. "I know," Penelope said softly, and somehow she did. The connection between them had grown into something neither had anticipated, something both frightening and exhilarating in its potential. Colton mounted his horse, his expression resolute. 3 days. If I'm not back by then, take the horses and head for Fort Elliott. Don't wait longer." Penelope nodded, though they both knew she would wait as long as necessary. "Godspeed, Colton." "Godspeed, Penelope." With a final nod, he turned his horse eastward and rode away, his figure gradually diminishing until he was swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. The hours after Colton's departure crawled by with agonizing slowness. Penelope divided her time between tending to Jacob's wound, helping Sarah salvage what she could from the burned wagons, and keeping watch for any sign of the raiders' return. That evening, as they huddled around a small, carefully shielded fire, Sarah studied Penelope with knowing eyes. "You care for him," she observed. "You're Mr. Daniels." Penelope's hand went instinctively to the pendant around her neck. "He saved my life," she said, which was true but not the whole truth. Sarah smiled faintly. "I saw the way he looked at you before he left, like a man memorizing something precious he might never see again." "We barely know each other," Penelope protested, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. In the intense days they had spent together, she had come to know Colton better than many people she had known her entire life. "Time doesn't always measure the depth of connection," Sarah said, glancing at her sleeping husband. "Jacob and I knew within a week of meeting that we would spend our lives together. Sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind is slow to accept." Penelope had no response to this wisdom, so simple and yet so profound. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about the Millers' life in Kentucky before they had decided to seek their fortune in the West. But Sarah's words lingered in her thoughts as night deepened around them. She took the first watch, sitting just inside the wagon with Colton's rifle across her knees. The prairie night was alive with sounds: the whisper of wind through grass, the distant howl of coyotes, the occasional rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. Each noise made her tense, imagining Hollis and his men returning to finish what they had started, but it was not raiders who disturbed the peace of their camp. Shortly after midnight, Penelope heard the approach of many horses, moving at a steady pace. She woke Sarah with a gentle hand over her mouth, warning her to silence. "Stay with Jacob," she whispered. "I'll see who it is." Heart pounding, she slipped from the wagon and moved to a position where she could observe without being seen. In the faint moonlight, she made out a group of riders approaching from the west, at least a dozen, moving in a disciplined formation that spoke of military training. Relief flooded through her as she recognized the blue uniforms of U.S. cavalry soldiers. She stepped into the open, keeping Colton's rifle pointed at the ground. "Hello, the camp," called the lead rider, a young lieutenant whose face was shadowed beneath his hat brim. "We're looking for Colton Daniels." Penelope's relief curdled into suspicion. "Who's asking?" The lieutenant urged his horse forward. "Lieutenant Thomas Warren, 10th Cavalry. Mr. Daniels was supposed to rendezvous with us 3 days ago near the Canadian River crossing." "Why would Colton be meeting with soldiers?" Penelope asked, not lowering the rifle. Warren's eyebrows rose slightly at her familiar use of Colton's name. "Because he works with us, madam. Has for nearly 2 years now, helping track down deserters and outlaws operating in the territory." This confirmation of Colton's unexplained personal interest in justice should have been reassuring, but Penelope found herself troubled by the realization that there was still so much about him she didn't know. "He's not here," she admitted finally. "He rode to Parker's Creek to get help for an injured man. Raiders attacked this family yesterday." Warren dismounted, his expression turning grave as Penelope explained about the attack and Hollis's involvement. "We've been tracking this gang for months," he said. "Daniels was supposed to report on whether the wagon master of your train matched our suspect's description." "He does," Penelope confirmed. "It's Hollis without question. I recognized him during the attack." Warren nodded, issuing rapid orders to his men. Half would continue tracking the raiders, while the rest would remain to help the Millers and escort them to safety once Jacob could be moved. As the soldiers efficiently set up camp around the wagon, Penelope found herself both relieved at the protection and increasingly concerned about Colton. If he had been expected to meet these soldiers days ago, where had he been? Why hadn't he mentioned his connection to the army? And more pressingly, if Parker's Creek lay to the east, why had Hollis and his men fled westward? The realization hit her with sickening clarity. Colton was riding straight into territory where the raiders might be regrouping. She approached Lieutenant Warren with her concerns. The young officer's face grew serious as he considered the implications. If Daniels encounters those men alone, he won't stand a chance, he agreed. But I can't split my forces further. The men I've sent after Hollis are our best trackers, and the rest are needed here to protect you and the Millers. Then I'll go after him, Penelope declared, the decision crystallizing in her mind. I know which direction he took, and I can follow his trail at first light. Warren's protest was immediate. Out of the question, madam, it's far too dangerous. More dangerous than staying at the river crossing would have been, more dangerous than what the Millers have already faced. She shook her head firmly. Colton risked his life to save mine. I won't abandon him to Hollis's gang. Her determination must have been evident, for Warren's expression shifted from outright refusal to reluctant consideration. You're not going alone, he said finally. I'll assign one of my men to accompany you at first light. Penelope nodded, accepting the compromise. Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll be ready to depart at dawn. Sleep was impossible after that. Penelope spent the remaining hours of darkness gathering supplies and preparing for the journey. Sarah tried to dissuade her, pointing out the foolhardiness of her plan, but eventually recognized the futility of her arguments. You love him, she said simply as she helped Penelope pack food for the journey. This time Penelope didn't deny it. I think perhaps I do, she admitted, the truth of it settling into her bones. It makes no sense. We've known each other such a short time. The heart has its own timeline, Sarah replied, echoing her earlier wisdom. Just be careful. Finding love only to lose it would be a cruel fate. As promised, Lieutenant Warren assigned one of his men to accompany Penelope, a seasoned tracker named Sergeant Davis, whose weathered face and quiet competence inspired confidence. They departed as the first rays of sun painted the eastern horizon, following Colton's trail eastward toward Parker's Creek. The journey was tense but uneventful through the morning hours. Sergeant Davis proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out signs of Colton's passage that would have been invisible to Penelope's untrained eye. A broken twig here, a hoofprint there, the faint depression in the grass where he had stopped briefly to rest his horse. By midday, they had covered significant ground, and Davis estimated they were perhaps 2 hours from Parker's Creek. It was then that they found the first troubling sign, a place where Colton's neat trail was intersected by multiple horses coming from the north. 5, maybe 6 riders, Davis assessed, studying the ground, caught up to him here. There was a chase. He pointed to the deeper hoofprints indicating galloping horses. Headed south now, away from the settlement. Penelope's throat tightened with fear. Hollis's men, Davis nodded grimly. Likely, your man put up a fight, though. He indicated a spot where the grass was trampled and stained with dark patches she realized with horror was blood. Is he? She couldn't finish the question. Can't tell whose blood it is, Davis said honestly. But there's no body, which means he was either taken prisoner or managed to escape. He straightened up, adjusting his hat. We follow the trail south. They rode hard through the afternoon, the trail leading them into increasingly rugged terrain. The open prairie gave way to rocky outcroppings and small ravines that could provide cover for an ambush. Davis became more cautious, frequently stopping to check their surroundings and the trail ahead. As dusk approached, they crested a small rise and saw smoke rising from a canyon about a mile distant. Davis immediately guided them into the cover of a stand of scrub oak. That'll be a camp, he said quietly. Could be Hollis's men, could be someone else. We'll approach carefully once it's darker. The wait was excruciating for Penelope, every minute an eternity when Colton might be injured or worse. Finally, as twilight deepened into night, Davis deemed it safe to move closer. They left their horses tethered in a sheltered spot and proceeded on foot, moving silently through the gathering darkness. As they neared the canyon, Davis held up a hand, signaling for Penelope to stop. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'll scout ahead and see what we're dealing with." Penelope nodded, pressing herself against a boulder as Davis disappeared into the shadows. The minutes stretched endlessly as she waited, straining her ears for any sound that might indicate his return or danger. When he finally materialized beside her, his expression was grim but determined. "It's Hollis's gang, all right. 7 men, including Hollis himself, and they have Daniels." Her heart contracted painfully. "Is he alive?" "Yes, but he's been worked over pretty good. They've got him tied to a tree near the edge of camp." Davis outlined what he had seen: the layout of the camp, the positions of the men, the fact that they appeared to be celebrating their capture with whiskey and seemed relatively unvigilant. "What's the plan?" Penelope asked, her mind already racing through possibilities. Davis gave her an appraising look. "I go in, create a distraction on one side of the camp. While they're dealing with that, you slip in from the other side and free Daniels. If he can ride, you both get out immediately. If not, I'll try to provide covering fire for your escape." It was a desperate plan with countless ways to fail, but Penelope saw no alternative. "I'll need a knife to cut his bonds." Davis handed her his hunting knife, the blade gleaming dully in the faint starlight. "Wait for my signal 3 owl hoots in quick succession. That'll mean I'm in position. Once you hear gunfire, move fast." Penelope nodded, her mouth dry with fear but her resolve unshaken. They separated, Davis circling wide to approach from the north while Penelope worked her way around to the southern edge of the camp where Colton was being held. The minutes crawled by as she positioned herself behind a large boulder approximately 50 yards from where she could just make out Colton's slumped form tied to a tree. Even from this distance, she could see that he had been badly beaten. His head hung forward, and his shirt was dark with what she assumed was blood. The raiders were gathered around a fire in the center of the camp, passing a bottle and laughing raucously. Holly sat slightly apart, his red beard visible in the firelight as he cleaned a large knife with methodical precision. 3 owl hoots broke the night's stillness, so natural-sounding that for a moment Penelope thought it might actually be a bird. Then she remembered it was the signal. Davis was in position. She gripped the hunting knife tightly, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared to move. Moments later, gunfire erupted from the northern edge of the camp. 2 quick shots followed by a third, strategically placed to suggest multiple attackers. The effect was immediate. The raiders scrambled for their weapons, shouting in confusion. Most moved toward the gunfire, leaving only Hollis and 1 other man near Colton. Penelope didn't hesitate. Keeping low, she darted from her hiding place toward the tree where Colton was bound. The darkness and the raiders' preoccupation with the supposed attack provided cover for her approach. She reached Colton undetected and pressed her hand over his mouth to prevent any sound of surprise. His eyes flew open, widening in recognition, and then alarm as he realized who had come for him. "It's all right," she whispered, quickly slicing through the ropes that bound his wrists. "Can you walk?" He nodded, though the movement clearly caused him pain. "Penelope, you shouldn't be here," he murmured as she helped him to his feet. "It's too dangerous." "Arguing wastes time we don't have," she replied, supporting his weight as they began moving away from the tree. "Davis is creating a diversion. We need to reach the horses." They had covered perhaps 20 yards when a shout went up from the camp. "The prisoner, he's getting away." Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets whining overhead or thudding into the ground nearby. Penelope urged Colton forward, half dragging him as his strength flagged. Despite his injuries, he managed to keep moving, though each step was clearly agonizing. More shots came from the northern edge of the Camp Davis, providing covering fire. The exchange gave them precious seconds to reach the relative safety of a small ravine, where they paused momentarily for Colton to catch his breath. "The horses are about a quarter mile east," Penelope explained, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind a bleeding wound on Colton's arm. "Can you make it that far?" He nodded grimly, his face pale but determined in the faint moonlight. "I've survived worse." They resumed their flight, moving as quickly as Colton's injuries permitted. Behind them, the sounds of gunfire had stopped, replaced by shouting and the pounding of hooves, the raiders organizing a search. They reached the horses just as the first riders appeared on the ridge above the ravine. Davis was already there, mounting his own horse while holding the reins of the other two. "Took you long enough," he said with forced lightness, helping Colton onto his mount. "Company's coming." Penelope swung into her saddle, adrenaline making her movements quick and decisive. "Which way?" "North," Davis decided after a moment's thought. "They'll expect us to head east toward the settlement or south toward the fort. North leads to rougher country, harder to track us there." They set off at a gallop, pushing the horses as hard as they dared in the darkness. Behind them, shouts and occasional gunfire indicated their pursuers hadn't given up the chase. For hours they rode, following game trails and dry creek beds, doubling back occasionally to confuse their trail. Davis proved his worth as a scout, guiding them through terrain that would have been impassable to less experienced riders. Eventually, as false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they reached a natural fortress of sorts, a rocky outcropping surrounding a small spring. Davis deemed it defensible enough to risk a brief rest. "They'll have lost our trail in the dark," he said as they dismounted, "but they'll pick it up again once it's light. We've got maybe an hour before we need to move again." While Davis tended the horses and kept watch, Penelope turned her attention to Colton's injuries. In the growing light, she could finally assess the full extent of the damage. His face was bruised and swollen, one eye nearly closed. A deep cut ran along his hairline, and his ribs were mottled with bruises suggesting repeated blows. "They were quite thorough," he commented wryly as she cleaned the worst of the wounds with water from the spring. "Why did they take you alive?" she asked, trying to keep her hands steady despite the anger and fear churning within her. "It would have been easier for them to simply kill me," Colton finished when she couldn't. Holly's wanted information, names of witnesses who could identify him, locations of army patrols, that sort of thing. "Did you tell him anything?" A ghost of Colton's usual smile touched his battered lips. "Nothing useful. I've had practice at keeping secrets." Penelope's hands stilled in their work. "Yes, I'm beginning to realize that. Lieutenant Warren told me about your work with the Army." Colton had the grace to look somewhat abashed. "I was going to tell you once we reached Amarillo." "Why wait? Did you think I wouldn't understand?" "It wasn't about understanding." He caught her hand, his touch gentle despite his injuries. "My work has made me enemies, dangerous ones. The less you knew, the safer you were." The simple honesty of his explanation diffused some of her hurt. "I think we're well past the point where ignorance offers any protection," she said softly. Before Colton could respond, Davis returned from his patrol of the perimeter. "Riders approaching from the south," he reported tersely. "At least 4 of them. We need to move." They mounted quickly, Colton grimacing with pain but managing without assistance. Davis led them north and west, into increasingly mountainous terrain where the horses struggled on the steep trails. By mid-morning, it became clear they couldn't outpace their pursuers indefinitely. The horses were tiring and Colton's strength was flagging visibly. Each time they paused to listen, the sounds of pursuit seemed closer. "We need to split up," Davis decided as they reached a fork in the trail. "I'll take the western path, leave obvious signs. With luck, they'll follow me, thinking I'm the injured one slowing us down. You two take the northern trail. It leads eventually to Trapper's Pass. Army patrol comes through there every few days. If you can reach it, you'll find help." Penelope began to protest, but Colton placed a hand on her arm. "He's right," he said quietly. "It's our best chance." Davis handed them his remaining ammunition and most of his provisions. "Good luck," he said simply, then turned his horse and rode west, deliberately leaving clear tracks in his wake. For a moment, Penelope and Colton remained at the fork, watching the sergeant disappear among the scrub pines that dotted the hillside. "He's a brave man," Colton observed. "Let's make his sacrifice worthwhile." They continued northward, the trail growing steeper and more treacherous. Colton rode in silence, conserving his strength while Penelope kept watch for any sign of pursuit. By late afternoon, they had gained considerable altitude, the air growing cooler as they climbed. "There," Colton said suddenly, pointing to a natural shelf in the mountainside ahead. "We can make camp there for the night. Defensible position with good visibility." The site was indeed well chosen, a flat area perhaps 30 feet across, backed by a sheer rock face and overlooking the trail they had ascended. A small spring trickled from the rocks, providing fresh water. Colton insisted on helping with the camp preparations despite his injuries, gathering firewood while Penelope tended the horses. By unspoken agreement, they decided against a fire, not wanting to risk its light being spotted from below. As dusk settled over the mountains, they shared a cold meal of jerky and hardtack, sitting close together for warmth. The events of the past days seemed to catch up with Penelope all at once, and she found herself trembling with delayed reaction. "You're cold," Colton observed, draping his blanket around her shoulders. "Not cold," she admitted. "Frightened, for you, for Davis, for what happens next." Colton's arm encircled her shoulders, drawing her against his side. The gesture was protective rather than presumptuous, offering comfort and human connection in the vastness of their wilderness surroundings. "I never meant to bring this danger into your life," he said, his voice low with regret. "When I found you at the river crossing, I thought only of getting you safely to Amarillo. I never imagined that I would follow you into a raider's camp." She gave a shaky laugh. "Neither did I, truth be told." "Why did you?" The question was simple but freighted with deeper meaning. Penelope turned to face him, her decision made in that moment. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of a world without you in it," she said honestly. "Because in the short time we've known each other, you've become important to me, more than important." In the fading light, she saw his expression soften, the guardedness that usually characterized his features giving way to something more vulnerable, more open. "Penelope," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not the man you deserve. My life has no permanence, no stability. I've done things." "I don't care about your past," she interrupted. "I care about who you are now, the man who came back for me when others left me behind, who risked his life to save a family from raiders, who fights for justice in a lawless land." She reached up to touch his face gently, mindful of his injuries. "That's the man I've come to care for." For a moment, he remained still beneath her touch, his eyes searching hers as if looking for doubt or deception. Finding neither, he slowly leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers. "I've been alone for so long," he confessed. "I told myself it was better that way, safer, simpler. But then I saw you standing in that river, refusing to be defeated by it, and something in me recognized something in you." "What?" she whispered. "Courage, determination. A refusal to surrender to circumstance." His hand came up to cradle her cheek. "You reminded me that there are things worth fighting for beyond justice and duty." The kiss, when it came, was gentle, a question rather than a demand. Penelope answered it without hesitation, her lips meeting his with a certainty that surprised even her. In that moment, the dangers surrounding them receded, overshadowed by the connection that had grown between them against all odds and reason. When they finally separated, Colton's expression was one of wonder tinged with lingering doubt. "If we survive this," he said, "if we reach Amarillo safely, would you consider?" He hesitated, seemingly at a loss for words. "Consider what?" she prompted, though her heart already knew the question. "A future," he said simply. "Together. Not immediately, perhaps. You should have time to establish your school, to be sure of your feelings when danger and necessity aren't clouding your judgment, but eventually." The offer, tentative and careful as it was, filled Penelope with unexpected joy. "I would consider it," she assured him. "More than consider it." His smile then, despite the bruises and exhaustion, was the most genuine she had seen from him, unburdened by the wariness that usually shadowed his features. They spent the night huddled together beneath their blankets, finding comfort in proximity without crossing the boundaries of propriety. Colton took the first watch despite Penelope's protests, insisting that his injuries weren't severe enough to impair his vigilance. When he woke her for her turn at watch, the sky was beginning to lighten with pre-dawn glow. "No sign of pursuit," he reported. With luck, Davis led them in the wrong direction. Penelope nodded, still drowsy but forcing herself to alertness. "Try to get some rest. We have a long ride ahead if we're to reach Trappers Pass by nightfall." Colton settled himself nearby, not quite touching her but close enough that she could hear his breathing. She watched as he slipped into sleep, his features relaxing, years seeming to fall away from his face. In repose, she could see the young man he must have been before war and loss had hardened him. The early morning passed peacefully, the mountains coming alive with birdsong and the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Penelope kept a vigilant watch, scanning the trail below for any sign of movement, but saw nothing more threatening than a deer picking its way carefully among the rocks. As the sun crested the eastern peaks, Colton stirred and sat up, grimacing as his battered body protested the movement. "Anything?" he asked, reaching for his canteen. "Nothing," Penelope confirmed. "The trail's been quiet." They broke camp efficiently, packing their meager supplies and readying the horses. Colton seemed stronger this morning, moving with greater ease despite his injuries. The rest, however brief, had done him good. The trail to Trappers Pass proved even more challenging than the previous day's journey. In places, it narrowed to barely the width of a horse, with a sheer drop on one side and towering rock face on the other. Penelope, who had never considered herself afraid of heights, found herself dizzy with vertigo at times, focusing resolutely on the path ahead rather than the yawning emptiness to her right. Colton rode ahead, his experience in such terrain evident in the confident way he guided his mount through the most treacherous sections. Occasionally, he would stop and dismount, checking the trail ahead on foot before signaling Penelope to follow. By midday, they had reached a more forested area, the trail widening enough that they could ride side by side. The relative ease of travel allowed them to talk, sharing thoughts and memories as they continued toward their destination. "What will you do after this?" Penelope asked at one point. "Assuming we reach Trappers Pass safely and Holly's is captured." Colton considered the question thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that. The Army's offered me a permanent position as a scout, but—" He shook his head. "I'm tired of hunting men. Tired of violence and the constant moving from place to place." "What would you do instead?" A faint smile touched his lips. "There's land available near Amarillo, good grazing land. I've saved enough over the years that I could make a start at ranching. It wouldn't be much at first, but with hard work." The idea of Colton settling in Amarillo, building a life there, sent a warm current through Penelope's chest. "I think you'd make an excellent rancher," she said sincerely. "It would mean staying in one place," he pointed out. "Something I haven't done since before the war. Perhaps it's time," she suggested softly, "to put down roots." The look he gave her then was full of meaning, but before he could respond, a sound from behind them caught their attention, the distant but unmistakable echo of hoofbeats on the trail below. "Riders coming," Colton said tersely, all warmth vanishing from his expression as he scanned their surroundings. "Fast." They urged their horses forward, abandoning conversation for speed. The trail continued to climb, switchbacking up the mountainside toward Trappers Pass. The hoofbeats behind them grew louder, suggesting their pursuers were gaining ground. "There," Colton pointed ahead to a narrow defile between two massive boulders. "We can make a stand there if necessary. The pass is just beyond." They had almost reached the natural choke point when the first shots rang out, bullets whining off the rocks uncomfortably close to their heads. Penelope's horse shied in panic, nearly sending her over the edge before she regained control. "Go," Colton shouted, drawing his pistol and turning his horse to face their pursuers. "Get through the pass. I'll hold them here." "I won't leave you," Penelope protested, drawing her own weapon, the rifle Davis had given her. "This isn't a debate." Colton's voice was harsh with urgency. "One of us needs to reach the Army patrol. You're the better rider and I'm already wounded. I'll create a bottleneck here, buy you time." The logic was sound, but the thought of abandoning him tore at Penelope's heart. "Promise me you'll follow," she demanded. "Promise you won't throw your life away." "I promise," he said, his expression softening momentarily. "Now go." With a last anguished look, Penelope urged her horse through the narrow passage between the boulders. Behind her, gunfire erupted as Colton engaged their pursuers. The trail beyond the defile descended slightly before opening onto a broad plateau Trappers Pass. Penelope raced across it, scanning desperately for any sign of the Army patrol Davis had mentioned. The pass was empty save for a few stunted pines and the crumbling remains of what might once have been a trapper's cabin. The gunfire behind her had intensified, suggesting Hollis and his men had reached the choke point where Colton made his stand. She reined in her horse, torn between continuing forward in hopes of finding help and returning to assist Colton. The decision was made for her when a familiar figure appeared at the far end of the pass, Sergeant Davis, accompanied by a dozen blue-uniformed cavalry soldiers. "Miss Jameson." Davis called, spurring his horse toward her. "Where's Daniels?" "Back there," she gasped, pointing toward the defile. "Holding off Hollis's gang. He needs help," Davis barked orders, sending most of the soldiers galloping toward the sound of gunfire while he and two others remained with Penelope. "We thought you might be in trouble when I reached the patrol yesterday and found you hadn't arrived ahead of me," Davis explained. "Been searching for you since dawn." The gunfire from the defile had reached a crescendo, then abruptly diminished to occasional shots. Penelope stared anxiously at the narrow passage, willing Colton to emerge unharmed. Long minutes passed before the soldiers began returning. Among them, supported between two mounted troopers, was Colton, bloodied but alive. Behind them came four prisoners, including the unmistakable figure of Hollis, his red beard now matted with blood from a wound to his temple. Penelope didn't wait for the group to reach her. She galloped toward them, eyes fixed on Colton. As she drew closer, she saw that he had taken a bullet to the shoulder, but his expression as he spotted her was one of profound relief rather than pain. "You're alive," she breathed, reining in beside him. "I made a promise," he reminded her, his voice weak but determined. "I intend to keep it." The journey to Fort Elliott was arduous but uneventful. Colton's wounds, while painful, proved less serious than initially feared. The bullet had passed cleanly through his shoulder, missing any vital structures. With proper care and rest, the Army surgeon assured Penelope he would make a full recovery. Hollis and his surviving men were placed under military arrest, charged with multiple counts of murder, robbery, and assaulting an agent working with the U.S. Army. Lieutenant Warren assured them that justice would be swift and certain. For a week, they remained at the fort, Colton gradually regaining his strength while Penelope rarely left his side. They spent hours in conversation, planning for the future with a cautious optimism that grew stronger as the days passed. On the 8th day, a military escort was arranged to accompany them the rest of the way to Amarillo. Before they departed, Colton received an official commendation from the fort's commander for his service in bringing Hollis's gang to justice. "They offered me another assignment," he told Penelope as they prepared for the final leg of their journey. Tracking a counterfeiting ring operating near San Antonio, her heart sank, though she tried not to show it. "Will you take it?" Colton shook his head, his expression serene. "I declined, told them I have more important matters to attend to in Amarillo." "Such as?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "Finding that piece of grazing land I mentioned, building a house, courting a schoolteacher if she's amenable." His eyes held a question. She's amenable, Penelope assured him, happiness blooming within her like a desert flower after rain. More than amenable. The journey to Amarillo passed without incident, their military escort ensuring safe passage through territories still occasionally troubled by raiders or hostile tribes. As they descended from the rugged highlands into the rolling prairie that surrounded the growing settlement, Penelope felt a sense of homecoming she hadn't anticipated. Amarillo in 1875 was still little more than a collection of buildings surrounding a central square, but it hummed with the energy of a place on the cusp of growth. The railroad was coming, locals told them eagerly, and with it, prosperity and expansion. Peter Jameson, Penelope's uncle, proved to be a hearty, silver-haired man with a booming laugh and a firm handshake. He welcomed his niece with genuine affection and extended the same warmth to Colton after hearing of their shared adventures. "Any man who'd brave a flooded river and a gang of cutthroats for my niece is welcome in my home," he declared, clapping Colton on his uninjured shoulder. The promised teaching position awaited Penelope, the town having completed a small schoolhouse in anticipation of her arrival. Classes would begin in 2 weeks, giving her time to settle in and prepare. Colton, true to his word, began inquiring about available land almost immediately. With Peter Jameson's guidance, he located a promising tract 10 miles outside town, 200 acres of good grazing land with a year-round creek running through it. "It's rough," he warned Penelope when he took her to see it. "Nothing but open prairie and a few trees along the creek. Building a home here would take time and hard work." Penelope surveyed the land, seeing not its current emptiness, but its potential, the house that could stand on the slight rise overlooking the creek, the garden she might plant, the cattle grazing peacefully on the rolling grassland. "It's perfect," she declared. "It just needs love and care to become a home." Colton's expression softened as he regarded her. "Like many things worth having," he observed. Their courtship proceeded with a proper respect for convention that sometimes frustrated them both, given all they had already shared. Peter Jameson served as a genial but vigilant chaperone, accompanying them on rides across the prairie or inviting Colton to dinner at his modest ranch house. Penelope threw herself into establishing her school, quickly winning the respect of both students and parents with her combination of firm discipline and genuine concern for each child's progress. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, fulfilling the dream that had brought her west. Colton, meanwhile, began the laborious process of transforming raw land into a working ranch. He hired 2 experienced cowhands to help, invested in a small starter herd of Hereford cattle, and began construction on a modest but solid house near the creek. Their wedding took place the following spring, a joyful celebration that drew people from throughout the county. Standing before the town's new church, Penelope felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place that transcended the improbable circumstances of their meeting. "I, Colton, take thee, Penelope, to be my wedded wife," he vowed, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." As she repeated the ancient promises, Penelope thought of the raging river where their story had begun, how close she had come to being swept away, how Colton had risked everything to carry her to safety. In the year since, they had carried each other through dangers and challenges that might have broken lesser bonds. The kiss that sealed their vows was brief but tender, a promise of the life they would build together on the land they both loved. Years passed, seasons turning in the endless cycle of prairie life. The small house by the creek expanded as their family grew, first with the birth of their son Benjamin in 1877, named in honor of the miller's fallen son, and then their daughter Sarah 2 years later. Colton's ranch prospered through hard work and smart management. By 1880, his herd numbered over 500 head, and his brand, the Connected CD, was respected throughout the Panhandle. He never returned to his work with the Army, finding greater satisfaction in building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. Penelope continued teaching until the birth of their first child, then focused her educational efforts on the growing number of children at neighboring ranches who couldn't easily reach the town school. Once a week, she hosted classes in their home, teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic to youngsters who might otherwise have grown up without formal education. The Millers, having recovered from their ordeal, settled permanently in Tascosa, occasionally visiting the Daniels ranch for holidays or special occasions. Sarah Miller became godmother to little Sarah Daniels, strengthening the bond between the families that had begun in such dramatic circumstances. Sergeant Davis, promoted to lieutenant following the capture of Hollis's gang, remained in the Army but maintained correspondence with Colton, keeping him informed of developments in the territories, and occasionally stopping by the ranch when duty brought him to the Panhandle. Hollis himself was hanged in the summer of 1876, having been convicted of multiple murders and robberies. Neither Colton nor Penelope attended the execution, preferring to leave that chapter of their lives firmly in the past. On the 5th anniversary of their meeting at the river crossing, Colton took Penelope on a ride to a special spot on their property, a small, tree-shaded pool where the creek widened briefly, before continuing its journey across the prairie. "I have something for you," he said as they dismounted, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small package wrapped in soft cloth. Inside was a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a river, studded with tiny blue stones that caught the sunlight. "To remember where we began," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. Penelope touched it reverently, tears welling in her eyes. "As if I could ever forget," she whispered. "You came back for me when everyone else left me behind." "Best decision I ever made," Colton affirmed, drawing her into his arms. "Though I never imagined where that river crossing would lead us." "To home," Penelope said simply, gesturing to the land around them, the distant site of their ranch house with smoke rising peacefully from its chimney. "To family, to love, to everything that matters." In the years that followed, as Amarillo grew from settlement to town to thriving city, as their children grew and the ranch expanded, as gray began to touch their hair and lines appeared around their eyes, Colton and Penelope Daniels remained true to the promises they had made beside that river to carry each other through whatever waters life might bring, to never leave the other behind, to face each crossing together. And on quiet evenings, when the prairie wind whispered through the cottonwoods and the western sky blazed with sunset fire, they would sometimes sit on their porch and tell their children and eventually their grandchildren the story of a river crossing, a brave cowboy, and the love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances, a love that, like the river itself, had found its way home across the vast, wild landscape of the Texas Panhandle.